that David escaped and went to Samuel, which remember is the one who anointed him as king, but he also anointed Saul as king. And so he must be very sad to find out that Saul is trying to kill David. And we know already that he was sad in the first place that God had rejected Saul as king, even though Saul had disobeyed God a bunch of times, because he loved Saul and he wanted him to have done the right thing and for God to continue to, allow him to be the king. But God had rejected him, and Samuel liked David. It says that the right away, as soon as he met David, he was attracted to him. And so he loved David. And actually, Saul had loved David too. So this is such a sad scenario, because the first time that he met David, he was meeting him as the boy that was coming to play the harp for him and make him feel better. And then the next time that he had an encounter with David was when David saved the whole kingdom by fighting Goliath. And this looked good on Saul. And so Saul had always liked David, but when David got more accolades than Saul did, then he began getting jealous. And so Samuel must have been very sad about this, but he also believed David. He knew that Saul was trying to do this, because he said, we really need to go escape to the place where all of the prophets are. And so they went and surrounded themselves with God's people so that maybe, Saul wouldn't attack them in that space. It would be like us fleeing to the church, hoping that nobody is going to go and kill us there in the church. And so that's what Samuel did. But Saul had sent messengers to kill David, and when they found him there in the presence of Samuel and all of the prophets, it says that the Spirit of the Lord overcame them, and they began prophesying themselves. And so they didn't kill David as they had been commanded. And then so Saul sent another set of messengers, and the same thing happened to them. And so after 3 times of this, finally Saul decides to go find David himself. And when he approaches Samuel and the prophets, sees that, he's in the presence of the man that had anointed him the king in the first place, he also begins prophesying. And so the power of the Lord is so strong in this place that even though they have the intent of doing something bad, the Spirit of the Lord overcomes them just because they're in the place where the Spirit of the Lord is, and they can't carry out their evil deed. And then it says that because Saul was in the presence of the Lord and in the presence of Samuel, it says that he stripped off his clothes, and he also prophesied before Samuel day and night. And some people believe that it means he was totally naked. Maybe he was, but all the commentators seem to agree that at least he was taking off all of his outer garments. And that would make him naked in a sense. It would make him where, he's in indecent clothes, but he's being vulnerable. And he's also taking off his royal clothing. That would be all of his outer clothing. And the point would be to show his vulnerability and his humility, realizing that he is not the king right now. He is just a man who is a sinner. And so he's showing that by what he's doing here. And then that passage ends by saying that because Saul began to also prophesy, that people said exactly what they said about him when he got anointed and was in the presence of the prophets. Is Saul also a prophet? This became a saying. And they say that this was the last time that we see the Spirit of the Lord come over Saul. And the Spirit of the Lord came over Saul in the beginning when he was anointed, and he prophesied in the presence of the prophets. And now it is happening again to him when he is in the presence of God, in the presence of the prophets. And so it's marking the beginning and the end of God's time with him as the king, showing that he is prophesying the first time and at the end of when God is recognizing him as the king. Even though he has, does remain the king for a little bit longer, God is not going to show his presence with Saul ever again. And he's, showing that he's totally rejected him as the king. And something that I just thought was so beautiful is how when the presence of God is in a certain place, it's like the people were just totally overcome. They couldn't even carry out their evil plans because God's presence was so incredibly strong. And so I wanted to read you two verses. Matthew 18:20 says, "For where two or more are gathered together in my name, I am in the midst of them." So we know that God's presence can be with us when it's just us, for sure. And that happens all the time when we are just by ourselves, praying, worshiping, reading His Word. He is with us. But He promises that when there are two or more gathered in His name, that He is there. And so, what a wonderful thing for us to see. And this is what all of us should do. When we realize our sin, we should immediately go to God, be in His presence, rather through, reading of the Word, prayer, worship, or going to church. We should get in His presence and stay there. If Saul would have stayed in the presence of the Lord, either in body as he is at this moment, or at least in spirit when he left the actual place. If he could have remained in spirit with God, praying, worshiping, reading His Word, then he probably never would have sinned, because when he was in the presence of the Lord, he couldn't sin. It's like he was so overcome with God's presence that he couldn't even carry out the evil thing that he wanted to do. And so that would have happened if he would have remained in God's presence. But as soon as he left the physical presence of God, he did not remain spiritually in God's presence. And so the feelings just came right back. And so in Hebrews 10:23-25, it says that all of us need to hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering. For He who promised is faithful. We need to hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, because God is faithful. And we need to consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, and not neglect meeting together, as is the habit of some. But we need to encourage one another, and all the more as we see the day of God approaching. We need to fellowship. When Saul was in the presence of all of these believers, he was vulnerable and convicted and repentant. And so being in God's, sometimes we may try to worship at home or read His Bible or pray, but we may not be able to do it. We still may be so overcome. And so we need to get more, than what we can just get by ourselves. And so we go to church, we surround ourselves with other people, or we just call another believer on the phone, whatever it is, but gather more people who also believe in God, so that, you can overcome your evil desires. And so right here, that's what it's saying, is that if we will go to church, we'll be surrounded with other people who can lift us up, who can encourage us to love and do the right thing. And so if Saul would have done that, if he would have remained in the presence of these people, or if he would have remained in the Spirit of God, then he would have been able to do this. But he didn't remain there. And so he, ended up, we're going to find out in a minute, falling to temptation. And so I want us each to think, before we move on to chapter 20, have you ever been in this situation before? Have you ever gone to church, or been in prayer, or been in worship, and felt like God told you to do something? But then literally the second you walk out the doors of the church, or you get up off your knees, or you stop saying the words, or you stop singing the song, or whatever it is, it's like you never remember it. It just completely slips your mind. It's like Satan just comes and snatches those thoughts right away. He talks about that whenever it says that the Word of God is like a seed planted in the ground. And if the seed falls on the good soil and it takes root, then you've got a good chance. But if the seed falls on rocky ground and the bird comes and takes it away, it's just like Satan. It's like we don't let it take root. And so what ends up happening is it just gets snatched away. Satan snatches that thought right out of our heads if we don't do something to, really plant it. So we have that thought in our minds while we're in church or prayer or worship or whatever. But then because we don't continue to think about it and then follow through pretty quickly on it, then Satan just comes and snatches it away. And that is what happened here. In James 1:22-25, it says, "Be doers of the word and not just hearers, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who observes his natural face in the mirror. But after he observes himself, he goes away and he immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of liberty and continues in it, and isn't a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, he is the one who will be blessed in what he does." And so don't be like the person who looks in the mirror and then forgets what kind of man he is, forgets what God has compelled him to do. Be the person that doesn't just hear what God says, but actually does it. If we will do that, then we won't be like Saul and go away and just immediately forget all of our convictions.